You are standing on a riverbank in Uganda when a wild elephant, a full-grown matriarch weighing 5 tons, walks toward you with a limping calf pressed against her side. She does not charge. She does not trumpet a warning. She stops 10 feet away, nudges the calf forward with her trunk, and waits. You are, in this moment, the single most dangerous species this animal has ever encountered. And she just handed you her baby. This is not a one-off. It is not a fluke caught on a lucky camera. This exact scene, an animal placing its most vulnerable offspring directly into human hands, repeats itself across species that share almost nothing biologically, on continents that never touch, in situations that have zero connection to one another. Once you notice the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you start asking why, the answer turns out to be far stranger and far more specific than animals somehow just know we're friendly. So let's ask the obvious question first, because you're probably already asking it. Why would any wild creature, built by millions of years of evolution to treat unfamiliar movement as a threat, walk toward the one species responsible for more habitat loss, more hunting, more disruption than every natural predator combined? By any reasonable logic, animals should treat us the way you'd treat a stranger circling your house at night. Instead, again and again, in situations with the highest possible stakes, we see the opposite. We see trust, deployed at exactly the moment it costs the most to be wrong. There is no single explanation for this. It's a stack of them, layered on top of each other, and by the time you reach the end of this, you may start looking at your own dog a little differently. Start with cats, because if you've ever fed a stray, you've probably lived through a version of this without realizing what was happening. Feral cat colonies have a long, well-documented habit of delivering kittens, sometimes newborn, sometimes injured, to specific people. Not random people. The one who leaves food on the back step. The one who once pulled a splinter out of a paw and apparently never lived it down, because now there's a rotating cast of kittens showing up like clockwork. Cats are quietly excellent at building what behaviorists sometimes describe as a running ledger of safe versus unsafe humans in their environment. They watch. They clock which humans move slowly, which ones feed reliably, which ones yell and swing brooms. Once a cat's internal ledger tips far enough in your favor, you stop being a potential threat and start being something closer to an honorary member of the colony. And honorary members get access to the kittens. Here's where it gets less explainable by, well, cats are basically domesticated anyway. Because the same pattern, watch, evaluate, trust, then deploy the offspring, shows up in animals with almost no history of living alongside us. Dolphins and whales have been documented approaching boats specifically when an injured calf is involved, and the behavior is strikingly deliberate. These aren't panicked, random encounters. There are recorded cases of a mother whale positioning an injured calf directly beside a vessel, holding still and waiting, as if she is saying, "Your turn." What could possibly explain that? Cetacean researchers, including work associated with Lori Marino's studies on dolphin cognition, have pointed to the sheer social complexity of pod life as part of the answer. Dolphins and whales already practice cooperative care within their own groups, shared babysitting, coordinated defense, communal rescue behavior when a pod member is in trouble. If your species already has the wiring to recognize this individual needs help, that individual over there can provide it. Extending that recognition across a species line isn't the enormous leap it first appears to be, especially toward a species that has been floating around in slow, loud, non-threatening boats for generations. There's a quieter detail buried in this too. Human boats are loud, yes, but human responses to visible distress are consistently gentle. Slow hands, lowered voices, careful movement. Animals read body language with an accuracy that should honestly unsettle us a little, and a species that reliably answers vulnerability with gentleness instead of aggression eventually gets filed under a completely different category in an animal's mind. We are everywhere, and we are loud, sure. But we are also one of the vanishingly few species that regularly goes out of its way to help offspring that are not our own, and are not even our own species. That reputation apparently travels farther than we'd expect. Now think about birds, because bird behavior around humans gets radically underrated in this entire conversation. There are documented cases of magpies, crows, and even some raptors bringing injured chicks towards specific humans who had previously shown some form of caretaking, feeding a local flock, rescuing a fallen nestling, that sort of thing. Crows in particular deserve their reputation here. The ornithologist John Marsluff, working at the University of Washington, ran a now-famous series of experiments showing that crows can recognize individual human faces and hold on to that recognition for years, passing warnings and apparently favorable impressions down to their own offspring who had never personally met the human in question. Doesn't that raise an unsettling possibility? That some of this baby-delivering behavior isn't purely individual trust earned firsthand, but something closer to inherited trust, passed socially from one generation to the next. A young bird raised around a parent who treats a specific human as safe may simply absorb that judgment the same way a child absorbs which neighbors are the friendly ones, without ever being told directly. Then there's domestication, which didn't just reshape animals physically. It rewired how certain species process dependency and trust at a fundamental level. Dogs are the clearest example. A mother dog who trusts her owner will often carry newborn puppies to that person one at a time and set them down, deliberately, like she's making a delivery she's been planning. This isn't random. Roughly 15,000 years of evolving alongside humans, built specifically around cooperative care and shared resources, means humans got filed somewhere in the dog brain under pack member with opposable thumbs, and pack members get access to the puppies. It isn't an accident. It's close to the entire point of how the relationship was built in the first place. And that same wiring seems to leak outward, occasionally into wild populations that were never domesticated at all. There are documented cases of wild wolves, coyotes, and foxes showing unusually low fear responses around specific humans, almost always in regions with a long history of low-conflict coexistence, feeding stations, reduced hunting pressure, generations of encounters that simply never turned violent. It isn't domestication, but it's something adjacent to it, a slow accumulation of low-stakes familiarity that occasionally produces behavior you'd expect only from an animal raised in a human household. Elephants might be the most emotionally devastating example in the entire topic, and it's worth sitting with that for a second instead of rushing past it. Elephant memory is famously enormous, and elephant social bonds run multi-generational and deep. The comparative psychologist Joshua Plotnick has spent years studying elephant empathy and social cognition, including behavior that looks remarkably like consolation, one elephant physically comforting, another that is distressed. Given that baseline, is it really so surprising that an elephant herd would approach a specific human, often a ranger or a sanctuary worker, with an injured calf, almost like they're requesting an intervention they cannot perform themselves? In several documented sanctuary situations, a mother has been observed presenting an injured calf to caretakers, stepping back and waiting, sometimes for hours, clearly anticipating help. What makes it stranger still is how long elephants hold onto specific human faces. There are stories of elephants recognizing former caretakers after a full decade apart, responding with behavior that looks unmistakably like recognition and relief. If an elephant can carry a positive memory of one specific person for 10 years, it stops being surprising that the same elephant would eventually decide that person is a safe option when a calf needs help. At this point, you're probably noticing something building underneath all of this, and it's worth naming outright. Nearly every example so far involves animals with unusually strong memory, high social complexity, and some history, even an indirect one, of low-threat contact with humans. This isn't random behavior scattered across the animal kingdom. It's closer to a slow-building, cross-species trust calculation, run case by case, generation by generation, memory by memory. There's also a less flattering, more practical layer worth being honest about, instead of only leaning on the warm version of this story. Sometimes delivering a baby to a human isn't a deliberate, thoughtful gesture at all. Sometimes it's closer to desperation. A mother facing a predator, a flooding den, an injury she cannot treat, may simply gravitate toward the nearest large, slow-moving, non-predatory shape available, which awkwardly, often, turns out to be us. Humans are big and loud and tend to smell like sunscreen, wood smoke, and questionable food choices, none of which reads as predator to an animal in crisis. In a moment like that, options narrow fast, and sometimes the trust-a-human option isn't trust at all. It's simply the least bad alternative left on the table. But even desperation-based trust still requires an animal's brain to run a risk calculation that, historically, we haven't done much to deserve. The fact that approach the human consistently beats every other option during a genuine crisis still says something remarkable about how animals have recalibrated their threat models around us over time. Despite an extremely mixed track record, we've somehow ended up coded as a viable emergency option across an enormous range of unrelated species. That's not nothing. Scent plays a bigger role in this than most people ever consider. Humans produce a distinct, fairly consistent chemical signature, somewhere between sweat, soap, food residue, and whatever detergent happens to dominate that decade. Animals with strong scent memory, which describes the overwhelming majority of mammals, appear to catalog specific human scent profiles the same way they'd catalog a known, safe member of their own group. Once a particular human's scent gets filed under safe and predictable, it seems to stay there for a startlingly long time, which might explain why some of these baby-delivering moments happen with animals that have only crossed paths with a person a handful of times before. Then there's the piece that ties the entire phenomenon together, and it rarely gets discussed. Humans are strangely, almost suspiciously good at recognizing distress signals from species we've never studied and never lived alongside. There is research suggesting that the pitch, rhythm, and urgency of distress vocalizations share enough structural similarity across mammal species that humans instinctively respond to them, even the very first time we hear them. A crying human infant and a distressed puppy trigger remarkably similar reactions in an adult human body: faster heart rate, immediate attention, and urge to go check. Some researchers, including work building on early ethological theory from Konrad Lorenz on infant features and caregiving responses, suggest this instinctive sensitivity might not be narrowly limited to our own species' young. It may be a broader, somewhat leaky caretaking reflex that occasionally fires for other species' offspring too. And if animals have, across generations, picked up on the fact that humans consistently answer distress with help rather than aggression, that reputation becomes something worth exploiting, even across a species line. This might genuinely be the most important thread in the entire pattern. We are one of remarkably few species on the planet that regularly, voluntarily, and repeatedly intervenes to help offspring that aren't our own and aren't even our own species. Most predators view another species' vulnerable young as a meal, full stop. Humans, despite a genuinely rocky overall relationship with the natural world, have built a surprisingly consistent reputation across multiple unrelated animal groups as the species that tends to choose help over harm when a baby animal is in trouble. Primates bring this uncomfortably close to home. There are documented cases of wild and semi-wild chimpanzees, bonobos, and certain monkey species near long-term research stations bringing injured or orphaned infants toward familiar human researchers. Given how closely primate social cognition mirrors our own, is that really shocking? The primatologist Frans de Waal has spent decades documenting alloparenting in primate groups, the practice of infants being cared for not just by their biological mother, but by a wider network of aunts, older siblings, and proven, trusted adults. Extending that same alloparenting logic to a long-term, consistently non-threatening human observer isn't the cognitive leap it first sounds like. If a chimpanzee troop has spent years watching a particular researcher move calmly and predictably, that researcher gets absorbed into the troop's mental map of acceptable infant-adjacent adults. That's a wildly specific category to earn membership in, and yet apparently one that's achievable with enough patience and zero sudden movements. There is an entire body of research sometimes referred to as the safe haven hypothesis, and while the name sounds like it belongs buried in a dense academic journal, the underlying idea is genuinely striking. The theory suggests that across multiple independently evolved social species, individual animals can form something structurally similar, though obviously far shallower, to the attachment bond between a human infant and its caregiver, this time directed at a specific human. Animals that build this kind of bond don't just tolerate that person. They actively seek them out during moments of stress, the exact same way a frightened toddler runs toward a parent instead of away in a random direction. Once you view it through that lens, does delivering a vulnerable baby to that person during a crisis still look strange? Or does it look like exactly what you'd expect from any creature seeking its version of safety? It's worth noticing how consistently this pattern clusters around genuine medical necessity rather than casual social bonding. Animals don't typically bring their young to humans to socialize. They bring them when something is visibly, urgently wrong. An injury, an entanglement, a wound that needs cleaning, a birth that's gone sideways. That detail matters because it suggests these animals aren't simply comfortable around humans in a general sense. They're making something that resembles a triage decision. They've identified a problem beyond their own capability, and they've identified a specific entity in their environment with a track record of solving exactly that kind of problem. That isn't blind trust. That's closer to outsourcing a task to a specialist, which is a genuinely impressive maneuver for a creature that, biologically, has every reason to keep predators and strangers as far from its vulnerable offspring as possible. This trust is not universal, and it is absolutely not unconditional. Populations with a long history of persecution, heavily hunted species, animals living in zones of chronic human conflict, show almost none of this behavior. The baby delivering pattern shows up almost exclusively where there's a long history of low-conflict coexistence, individual positive past encounters, or species with the memory and social cognition to make nuanced, case-by-case judgments about specific humans rather than judging our species as a monolith. Animals aren't extending trust to humanity in general. They're extending it to you, specifically, the one who left food out, who moved slowly during a previous encounter, who didn't scream and bolt the last time something wild and unexpected showed up. There's a feedback loop buried in here too, worth naming plainly. A human responds well to one distressed animal. That animal, or its wider social group, remembers. Future generations within that group inherit a slightly lower baseline fear response, either toward humans broadly or toward one specific person. And the cycle keeps rolling forward, case by case, slowly compounding into exactly the kind of behavior we've been describing this whole time. None of this is animals secretly knowing, in some grand cosmic sense, that we're good. It's smaller than that, and honestly more interesting than that. It's accumulated, repeated, individually earned evidence, building case by case until a wild animal looks at one specific human and quietly concludes, this one's probably fine. Hand over the baby. So why do animals bring their offspring to humans? Not because we've earned some sweeping, universal trust from the animal kingdom. Our overall track record is far too inconsistent for that. It's because, across an enormous range of species and an enormous range of crises, individual animals have built individual case files on individual humans. And some of us, enough of us, keep passing the test. Every slow approach to an injured animal, every bowl of food left out for a stray, every quiet, careful response to something wild and frightened becomes a small data point in a ledger most of us never realize we're contributing to. And every so often, when the stakes are at their absolute highest, when a baby's life hangs in the balance and a desperate parent is scanning the world for literally any option that isn't certain death, that ledger gets cashed in. A human ends up holding a kitten, a calf, a chick, or an injured pup, wondering how on earth they became the chosen one. Consider seabirds for a moment, because they add a wrinkle nobody expects. Albatross colonies and certain gull species have been observed nudging injured chicks toward researchers stationed on remote islands for months at a time. Researchers who feed no one, who offer no food reward whatsoever, who exist purely as a quiet, familiar presence on the landscape. What does that tell you? It suggests the trust being built here isn't always transactional. It isn't always about who hands out fish or scraps. Sometimes it seems to be built almost entirely on consistency alone, on a human simply showing up, day after day, without ever behaving like a threat. Predictability, on its own, appears to be worth almost as much currency to a wild animal as an actual reward. A creature that can reliably guess what you'll do next has, in some fundamental sense, already decided you're safe, even if you've never fed it a single thing. Marine mammal researchers have documented something structurally similar in seal colonies along the coasts of places like Namibia and California, where mother seals with injured pups have approached specific rangers repeatedly over multiple seasons, always the same individual, never a stranger standing nearby. That specificity matters enormously. It rules out the simplest explanation that these animals are just generally comfortable around any human shape. If it were that simple, any person standing on that beach would trigger the same behavior. Instead, these animals appear to be running a kind of facial and behavioral recognition system finely tuned to one individual, filtering out everyone else in the vicinity as an unknown quantity, still worth avoiding. There's a psychological concept worth borrowing here, even though it was built to describe human relationships rather than animal ones. Attachment researchers, building on foundational work from John Bowlby on caregiver bonds in human infants, describes something called a secure base, a figure whose mere presence lowers stress and increases exploratory, confident behavior in the individual attached to them. Some ethologists studying human-wildlife interactions have started borrowing that exact framework to describe what happens with long-term wildlife researchers in the field. A specific human becomes something functionally similar to a secure base for an animal or a whole social group. Not a parent, obviously, but a stable, predictable presence whose proximity seems to reduce anxiety during moments that would otherwise trigger a full flight response. Doesn't that reframe the entire phenomenon a little? These aren't animals suddenly deciding humans are safe in some abstract, philosophical sense. They're running the exact same psychological machinery that governs how a child relates to a trusted adult, just aimed, unexpectedly, at us. Bats offer a strange and almost overlooked example too. Colonies in parts of Australia and Southeast Asia have shown documented cases of mothers relocating injured pups closer to wildlife rehabilitation volunteers who visit on a predictable schedule, sometimes waiting near enclosure fences until the same volunteer arrives for their shift. Bats aren't known for warm, sentimental behavior toward much of anything, which makes this pattern stand out even more starkly. If a species with famously limited social bandwidth toward outsiders can still build this kind of specific, individual trust, what does that suggest about how widespread the underlying mechanism actually is? It suggests this isn't some rare, isolated quirk restricted to famously intelligent or famously social animals. It might be closer to a baseline capability sitting dormant in far more species than we've given credit for, waiting for the right combination of time, consistency, and low-conflict contact to switch on. Even farm animals, creatures we tend to think of as passive participants in whatever arrangement humans have built around them, show flickers of this same behavior. Sanctuary workers have documented mother goats and pigs, rescued from industrial settings and given years to recover in a low-stress environment, eventually bringing newborns directly to specific caretakers rather than keeping them hidden, the way most prey animals instinctively do in the first days after birth. That instinct to conceal a newborn is deeply wired, evolutionarily ancient, present across an enormous range of species precisely because a hidden newborn is a safer newborn. Choosing to override that instinct, to actively present a vulnerable offspring to a specific individual instead of hiding it, is not a small thing. It is, in a very real sense, one of the most costly trust signals an animal is capable of sending. There's one more layer that rarely makes it into this conversation, and it might be the most quietly profound part of the whole thing. This kind of trust changes the humans on the receiving end of it too. Rangers who've lived through it often describe it as one of the defining moments of their careers, proof that the slow, often invisible work of building trust with wild populations actually means something when it's tested. Conservation researchers have started treating these moments not just as heartwarming footage, but as legitimate indicators of ecosystem and human-wildlife relationship health in a given region. A population willing to approach humans during a crisis is usually a population living somewhere with lower hunting pressure, lower habitat conflict, and a longer history of coexistence rather than competition. In a strange way, these moments function as an informal report card on how well the humans in a given place have actually been behaving toward the wildlife around them. There's a version of this story that plays out closer to home than any elephant sanctuary or remote research station, and it's worth pausing on before wrapping up. Backyard wildlife, the deer that wander into suburban yards, the raccoons that raise litters under a porch, the rabbits that nest in a garden bed, show flickers of this same calculation on a much smaller, quieter scale. A doe that repeatedly beds her fawn near a specific house rather than deeper in the tree line isn't choosing randomly. She's made an assessment, probably built from months of watching that yard, that the risk of predators is lower there than almost anywhere else nearby, and that the humans attached to it have never once behaved like something worth fleeing. It's a smaller, less dramatic version of the exact same trust ledger that produces a dolphin nudging a calf toward a boat. The stakes look different. The underlying math doesn't. It's worth sitting with how fragile all of this actually is, because that fragility is the point. A single bad interaction, one thrown rock, one aggressive dog let off a leash, one moment of a startled animal being chased instead of left alone, can erase months or years of accumulated trust in an instant. Ledgers like this build slowly and collapse fast. That asymmetry alone should tell you how remarkable it is that any of this trust survives long enough to produce something as dramatic as a mother directly presenting her offspring to a stranger. It means, somewhere along the way, an enormous number of small interactions had to go right, consistently, for long enough, without a single catastrophic one undoing all of it. And maybe that's worth remembering the next time you're the one standing at the edge of some encounter with a wild animal, deciding in real time whether to move closer or step back, whether to make noise or stay silent, whether to reach out a hand or simply let the moment pass without disturbing it. You are, in that instant, whether you realize it or not, making a deposit or a withdrawal in a ledger that outlives the encounter itself, one that some future version of that animal, or its offspring, or an entirely different animal watching from a distance may end up drawing on someday in a moment neither of you can currently see coming. Maybe that's the real shape of this whole phenomenon. Not a story about animals being unexpectedly sentimental or magically able to sense good intentions. A story about consequences. About every quiet, patient, non-threatening interaction, slowly compounding into something that eventually gets tested at the worst possible moment, when a parent has nowhere else to turn and a baby's life is hanging by a thread. Every time that test gets passed, it reinforces something fragile that took generations to build, and that could probably be undone in a single careless afternoon. So the next time you hear about a whale nudging an injured calf toward a boat, or a stray cat parading kittens across a porch, or an elephant herd standing patient and still beside a wounded calf, waiting, don't file it away as just another wholesome clip. File it away as evidence. Proof that on a planet full of species with every reason to fear us, we have somehow, in scattered pockets, across scattered generations, convinced a few of them that we are worth the risk. And that the next time a matriarch walks toward you with her calf at her side, she isn't gambling on a stranger. She's collecting on a debt you didn't know you'd been paying into all along.